Now that I had the infinite banking concept started, I continued the practice of borrowing from my policy and chunking to my broker account. I already had a Roth IRA opened but was not active in the account. Before I move on to the Roth IRA, let me review my progress so far. I had put all of my money into the broker account and started doing calls and puts. I then opened my life insurance policy and started the infinite banking concept. I took the money that I needed to max out the policy from the broker account. Once the policy was maxed out, I then chunked a small portion back to the broker account to increase the capital in which to do calls and puts. The money the calls and puts produced, I used to pay back the loan on the policy. When I was in debt, I used the velocity banking strategy to get out of debt. I was essentially doing the exact same thing here by using creative imagination to assume the broker account itself was the debt and the policy was the debt tool. I am convinced to become wealthy, all I need to do is pay off the insurance loan. I just need to make sure to borrow again from it before it reaches 100% paid back. At this point is when I really started to look at what I was doing as a business. I thought to myself, most businesses provide a retirement plan, health plan, and you get paid from the work that you do. So I started to look into my Roth IRA as the retirement plan part of the business. Before I jump into the Roth IRA, I just want to reiterate that this is not advice for you to open a Roth IRA. I am not a financial advisor, and any knowledge I have on the Roth IRA is limited to the research I've done on the subject. This is just my account of what I've done in my personal life. I knew that Charles Schwab had a Roth IRA, and since I already had my broker account with Charles Schwab, I decided to open the Roth through them. Once I logged into my account, I hovered over accounts and went down to open an account. This brought me to their accounts page. They had tabs with certain accounts, and I knew that I wanted to open a Roth IRA, which is a retirement account. So I clicked on retirement. This listed a few accounts: the traditional IRA, Roth IRA, rollover IRA. I wanted to open a Roth IRA, so I clicked on start. The next page let me know that I will need my address, social security number, employer's name, and mailing address. The next page brought me to provide personal information. Since I already had an account with them, a lot of this was already pre-filled. It was pretty easy to do. The next page, I had to provide the legal address and phone number. The next page brought me to my employment and financial details. Once this was done, it basically had the terms and conditions, and then it opened the Roth IRA. It was really easy to do since they already had most of my information. Most of all of this was already filled out, and a Roth IRA was open. One other thing I did was I did apply for options trading. In a Roth IRA, you're only allowed to go up to level 0, which is fine. That's all that I needed to mimic what I was doing in the broker account. I knew that the limit for the Roth IRA was $6,000 a year. So in the early years when I couldn't really afford to put the whole $6,000 in all at once, I took a calculator and I took $6,000 and I divided it by 12. And this came out to $500 a month. And this is where, especially in the beginning years, depending on if I could fully fund it, if I wasn't able to afford the $500, I already had the business going and I had the family bank going. So depending on what I made, let's say I made $1,200 that week or that month, I would first and foremost, the family bank always did 24%. At the very least, I figured if taxes or something came up, I'll be able to have that amount back into the family bank, or it just depended. It depended on, and this is something that it just evolved over time to where eventually it didn't matter. But the Roth IRA, depending on when I get into the other videos on the HSA, I would just put a certain percent here to see if I knew I was going to make enough and I needed $500 a month. I would put whatever percent that would equal 500, which was about 42%. And again, this is where goals really came in and what really was the most important to me at the time. Anyone mimicking this or wanting to do this, it depends on what is important to you. When you first start off, you don't really realize how much taxes affect your wealth. For a lot of people, they just want to get some money back in taxes at the end of the year, not really realizing or not having a plan. They don't know to try to maximize your tax savings. And I remember in the early years, I wasn't really putting much in the Roth IRA at all, even though if I knew what I knew now, I might have put more in there. But basically, so far, I had the broker account going, and I had the Roth IRA open, and I had the infinite banking open. So I was, depending on what this generated, the money was going into the infinite banking. If there was no loan, I always kept a loan on here. If this was getting pretty close to being paid off, I would borrow back and increase the capital. So depending on how much I wanted to put in the Roth IRA, I would come over and I would enter that percent. So let's say I wanted to put 10% in the Roth IRA. If I only made $500 that week, then only $50 would have went to the Roth IRA, $120 to the family bank, back into the policy, and then reinvested would be 66%. But in the beginning, I wasn't, until that loan was paid off, I had that at zero, which means 90% would have been going back into the family bank. So if I made $500 that week, $450 would have went back into the bank and $50 into the Roth IRA. Once this infinite banking got big enough, I could put zero into the Roth because I just went ahead and transferred from the family bank $6,000 into the Roth, and it was done. Then the covered calls being produced would just pay back that loan. So instead of that $6,000 coming back and chunking into here to increase the capital, it would go into the Roth IRA. Once it was paid back, then I continued the chunking process back into the covered calls. Setting all this up and keeping track of it is a long process. This is where I cannot stress how the writing down of my plans have helped me. Having a plan and sticking to it have molded me into a new person. My eyes started being open on things I never knew were possible. It always seems that one thing led to another and then to another, and it always get better over time. People always ask me, how do I know so much about this stuff? And the answer is simple. It is a lifelong process. I had to put down the remote, stop making excuses, and focus on what I wanted out of life. The most enriching part of all of this is I get to pass it down to my son and my future generations. The wealth building process has to start with someone, and for my family, it started with me. In the next video, I'll continue on with the blueprint and the HSA.